I am asked on an almost daily basis what the best Final Fantasy is to someone who's never played one before, or to recommend to a friend who has never played one before. And so as somebody who has played pretty much every single game in the franchise extensively, including the more niche picks, here is a guide to which Final Fantasies you should play first if you want to learn more about the franchise. As with any tier list or opinion piece in general, something like this is going to be subjective, and while I have a lot of experience with the Final Fantasy franchise and feel I'm in a great position to help people navigate it, others might feel differently, so I'm both going to be showing my community's thoughts on this matter after my own, thanks to comments from my Patreon members, as well as encourage you guys to tell everyone which Final Fantasy you think is best to recommend to a new player, even if it's not listed in this video. The games I've put in this list, by the way, are all games that are widely available to everyone on modern devices in 2025. I don't believe I've missed any, but if I have, then please do let me know in the comments. And as always, the aim of these videos is to help the wider gaming community and allow us to find our tribe, so to speak, and share a common love of the gaming medium and embrace the differences in our opinions. So keep it cute and keep it classy in the comments. So of course, where best to start than right at the very beginning with the very first Final Fantasy game, which, like Final Fantasies 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, are now commonly available thanks to the Pixel remasters. I don't think that Final Fantasy 1 is a particularly bad place to start because there's a lot to be said for wanting to experience the entire Final Fantasy franchise from the very beginning, and there's a lot that works to its benefit here. The story is very simple and it's very easy to follow. It's a classic tale of good versus evil, unless you go deep diving into other games in the franchise like Dissidia and Stranger of Paradise. It showcases the turn-based combat at its very core, so it's really establishing the roots of what Final Fantasy has always been. It's shorter than a lot of other Final Fantasy games, so if you want something to dip your toes into, then you could. And obviously there's other ports and remakes available of Final Fantasy 1, so if you wanted to go into like deep diving this particular title, that option is present for you. However, it's not the biggest recommendation for me because it's so simplistic and basic compared to a lot of games in the series that if you're not looking to explore its origin and its roots, I'm coming at this from a first-timer's Final Fantasy perspective, and I really think that this is great as like a third or fourth Final Fantasy for a lot of people, ironically, considering it's the first, because it is very simple, it is very grounded in its roots, and it's not a game that a lot of story-driven players are going to gravitate towards like they would a lot of other games in the franchise. When you hear about Final Fantasy, you tend to hear about its story before its gameplay. I'm not somebody that plays them that way. I actually like the more gameplay-focused games in the series, but a lot of people are going to be coming at it from a narrative perspective. So it's older visuals, it's older music, like it's very, very much a hallmark of its time, even with the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster version. So I think there are pros and cons to playing the very first Final Fantasy game first. I don't think I can really put Final Fantasy 1 in like the bottom tiers of this list because I don't think it would be a questionable choice even to play the first game in the franchise first because there's a lot of sense to be made in that. But I also don't think it's a great choice either because it's not narrative driven in the same way as a lot of the other games are. The characters are very blank, they're meant as avatars for the player. It's very rooted in D&D references rather than self-referential like a lot of the other games are. There's less anime influence involved. And I think that somebody who's playing a Final Fantasy game for the first time might also find it a bit too challenging, but not in the right ways. Like it's grindy, but it's not too grindy like some of the other games in this list. I think I'm happy to put it in the solid choices category. I'd say it's a solid B tier, but I wouldn't put it any higher or lower than that. Continuing with the Pixel remasters, we then move into Final Fantasy 2, and I honestly think this is fairly easy to place on the tier list because it's definitely not the game I would recommend as any player's first Final Fantasy. I think perhaps when this game was first released in the 80s, there's an argument to be had for people who did experience this game first and really like it, but considering that it separates itself quite dramatically from the other Final Fantasy games, I feel like the only reason that you would start this first is if you'd played the Saga franchise before you'd played Final Fantasy, which I'd consider fairly unlikely, and you liked those, because it shares more in common with them than the other FF games. Let me make it clear, I don't think Final Fantasy 2 is a bad game. A lot of Final Fantasy fans really dislike Final Fantasy 2, and I think it leans into experimentation, which is something that Final Fantasy actually does a lot of over the course of time, and it tries something very different from its predecessor, and then later games in the franchise do a very similar thing. The leveling system is a little bit quirky and is more based on D&D, Western RPGs. The more you do something, the better it gets, but it just doesn't translate very well to a modern audience, and with the Pixel Remaster, it doesn't really change anything like that, and there's a lot of frustration that can be had with Final Fantasy II that the other games just don't really have. Like, there are dead ends in dungeons that make it really awkward to get into and, like, just stick with. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't put this high, I can tell you that now. And so because of that, I think it's fairly safe to put 2 in the don't start here category. I genuinely believe that a lot of people, if they were to start with Final Fantasy II, probably wouldn't go on to play any of the others. And to me, that is very much indicative of a game not to start a franchise with. If it's going to put you off the rest of the franchise, don't start with this one. And honestly, I kind of feel the same way about Final Fantasy III. And that's, again, not to say that Final Fantasy III is a bad game. It isn't. There's a lot to really love about it. It introduces the job system, which is extremely influential on the rest of the franchise. So if people wanted to explore the origins of that, then they could. It's got a much more expansive world map than the other 2 before it, but not as much as some of the ones after it. There are other variants of Final Fantasy III, which I'll get into in a moment, that you could explore because they are also available on Steam or Android as well, if you wanted to try that way. But I also don't think it's the greatest place to start. There's big difficulty spikes in Final Fantasy III that's really, like, challenging to come across, and it's also very simple, and it's also grindy. There's not a lot of story. In terms of story, I'd argue that 3 is actually the weakest one of them all. Of course, as I said, there are alternate versions of Final Fantasy III that you have access to, because the 3D version is available on Steam and Android, as well as the 2D version being available on Pixel Remaster. But the way that I would look at it is, there's a reason that you don't see a lot of people putting up their plays of Final Fantasy III and it get a lot of traction on social media. It's not one that's particularly popular as a first choice when it comes to Final Fantasy in general. Even though I do actually like both the 2D and 3D versions as separate copies, I just wouldn't start with this one. It also doesn't help that the job system in this game, because it's the first instance of it, it's not very well balanced, so I wouldn't want to recommend Final Fantasy III, either 2D or 3D, to a player if I felt that they were going to, like, really enjoy something like a job that's in the game and then not get to use it very well because they're just struggling and they're on an uphill struggle because of the jobs they've chosen. So I just think that there are better versions of Final Fantasy III, certainly with the job system and everything, that a player could explore instead of this one as their first choice. So again, I don't think Final Fantasy III is a bad game. I like Final Fantasy III, both 2D and 3D. Got no problem with the game as a whole, but for a first timer, I just think that anything that you would get from FF3, you would probably get from other games in the franchise. Though I actually do think, certainly with the DS version of Final Fantasy III, people probably did start here, so I'd love to hear from people who did and ask whether it did pull them into the franchise and did get them to explore the games. I think that that's going to be true for all of the games on this list, so I'm only speaking from my own experience and from the lots and lots and lots of times people have asked me, whether I've been streaming on Twitch or in comments in videos like this one, where I would suggest people start, and it's never 2 or 3. Now, just like every other time I've spoken about Final Fantasy in terms of a tier list, Final Fantasy IV is where we start to really ramp things up. FF4 is the first truly character-driven Final Fantasy story. Final Fantasy II does have, like, named characters like Firion, Maria, Guy, etc., but they aren't really put front and center into the story. It's more about the circumstance that they're in. They're not memorable in the same way as characters like Rydia, or Palamon or Cecil, Kain, Golbez. There's a lot of characters that you can come away from Final Fantasy IV and go, that was my favorite character in the game. And while Final Fantasy IV is more linear, I would say, than a lot of the other Final Fantasy games are, it still manages to capture the essence of Final Fantasy really well. And I feel that the simplicity actually lends itself to being a better recommendation for someone who's never played a Final Fantasy before. So while some of the mechanics might be a bit outdated compared to certainly later games in the franchise, there's still, like, a lot of iconography in this game that just works. There are battle themes that you will remember for a very long time to come after playing this. There are characters that you'll love. There are mechanics that you'll enjoy, boss fights that you'll remember. I think that FF4 is actually a great place to start. And much like Final Fantasy III, you do have access to the 3D version of Final Fantasy IV on PC and mobile as well. I think they're still available on mobile. But I wouldn't go for this version first, mainly because I feel like 2D sprite work, certainly with pixel remasters and things like that, just age better than early 3D models. And bearing in mind that this is a port of a DS game, I feel that the 2D version is going to appeal to players who enjoy sprite work from indie games and things like that. Certainly more than a game that just looks old rather than just intentionally being made to look that way. I do, however, think that Final Fantasy IV overall is a great place to start in Final Fantasy. It's got great characters. It's got a lot of hallmarks of Final Fantasy as a whole, like the ATB system, the active time battle system that have been used many times since Final Fantasy IV's debut. It's simple enough to grasp, but it's challenging enough in the right places, like some of the boss fights can be pretty tough, that it will feel engaging. So I actually think that Final Fantasy IV is in A tier. I would say it's a great choice for players to start here. So Final Fantasy V is actually one of my favorite Final Fantasies in the entire Final Fantasy pantheon. And I think that it's a good place to start for Final Fantasy, particularly to players who aren't as fussed by the story, but are more intrigued by gameplay mechanics in JRPGs and how you can mix and match different characters to your needs. So Western RPG fans, I think, would actually do very well with Final Fantasy V. I think that Final Fantasy V is really good for people who want something lighthearted. However, it's as I've said with previous entries in the franchise, when people recommend Final Fantasy to others, certainly in my experience, the first thing they'll tend to talk about is the story. Final Fantasy V is a lot more light on its story. It's more light-hearted in tone for the most part. It's fun. There are some very impactful moments in Final Fantasy V, and given that this is a first-timers Final Fantasy video, I'm not going to go into spoilers of any kind with this. But there isn't a lot of gravitas for the most part with the characters. And the job system, while I think it's a much better integration than Final Fantasy III had, it might be overwhelming to newcomers who maybe think that there's too much choice going on and they don't have a lot of individuality within each character, because every character can basically turn out the same. It's more about the customization and the exploration of mechanics. So if that's something that you like the sound of, then Final Fantasy V may well be for you. But it doesn't have that epicness that later Final Fantasy has. So if it's the story that you're going for, then maybe I'd steer clear of FF5 as your first one. Final Fantasy V doesn't have a 3D version like 3 and 4 did, because those were remade for the DS and then ported to various places, so your only real option on modern devices is the pixel remaster for Final Fantasy V. But I think it's a good choice to start. As I said, if you're focused on gameplay mechanics and not so much the story, there's so much replayability to Final Fantasy V, it's not even funny. 4-Job Fiesta is something that's very well celebrated amongst the Final Fantasy community, as something that's done every year to raise money for charity. I've done it myself. I recommend other people do it. I think it's brilliant for that kind of thing. But again, I wouldn't choose it as your first Final Fantasy. I think there are others that encapsulate that feel better than Final Fantasy V, even though it's one of my favorites. If you are looking for a story-driven RPG in a pixel art style, you enjoy the pixel art style and you want to dive into something that is well-loved, not just by Final Fantasy fans, but gaming fans as a whole, and you want that history, look no further than Final Fantasy VI. The iconography of the characters and the ensemble cast, brilliant. One of the best villains ever to grace the screen, certainly in the Super Nintendo era, and it's still one of the most memorable villains that Final Fantasy's ever had. The story is really well told, certainly for its time. The music is brilliant. The combat is approachable. Each character has individuality, but there's still enough room to be malleable and cater the characters to your needs. There's a lot to love about Final Fantasy VI. This is really one of the best ones to start with. Truth be told, from the perspective of a new player, I can't really fault Final Fantasy VI. There are like small sort of bits and pieces that you could pick apart that say that like maybe you wouldn't love Final Fantasy VI as much as the others. But equally, I think if you like Final Fantasy VI, you're pretty safe in the knowledge that you're gonna like other games in the franchise, certainly within the first 12 of them. So I think that because of that, as well as all of this iconography that Final Fantasy VI has within Final Fantasy, there's just too much to love. And unlike early 3D games, the 2D pixel sprites and the pixel remaster really elevates it so that it still appeals to newcomers in the same way as it would someone who played it 20, 25 years ago. And so because of that, I think genuinely that Final Fantasy VI is one of the best places to start for a Final Fantasy newcomer. It's got everything. It's got the story, it's got the mechanics, it's got the approachability, which I think is really important when it comes to recommending a game in a storied franchise like Final Fantasy to somebody that's new to it. I want to have people be able to come away from it and go, that game was amazing by itself. And that's something a certain games on this list will lack. So I think that because of those factors, FF6 is the first one sitting at the top. Final Fantasy VII is legendary. There's no other word to describe Final Fantasy VII when it comes to its place in gaming history. And so it would normally be very easy to look at Final Fantasy VII and say, yes, you should absolutely start here first. Anyone who's ever heard of Final Fantasy has heard of characters like Cloud and Sephiroth and Aerith. And by and large, there's a lot to really like about it from a first player's perspective. The turn-based combat is accessible, the ATB gauge is in full force here, the materia system allows for a lot of like malleability, and it's a widely available game. You can get this on basically any console that you've got. And it's a massive cultural touchstone. It feels like it's essential to anyone who is even remotely interested in Final Fantasy to want to play Final Fantasy VII first. However, I am firmly of the belief that this is more of a commentary of the way that people play games nowadays rather than a commentary on Final Fantasy VII itself. The visuals on Final Fantasy VII are very difficult to sell to somebody that's new to the franchise. Like, it's very hard to get somebody to play a early 3D title for the PS1. I would say it's harder to do that than to get them to play something from the Super Nintendo era. And with like the pixel remasters, they are updated so that they run really smoothly for the most part. They look pleasant, like there's like shimmer on the water, things like that, that the original Final Fantasy VII doesn't have. And it's a visual on how games were back in the 90s, that there are certain mechanics that might feel janky to a newer player. And it doesn't help that there is a remake of Final Fantasy VII, even if it's not finished yet. So my only worry with Final Fantasy VII as a first-timer's recommendation, despite it being this legendary story with incredible characters, much loved across the globe, is that its age works to its detriment. And I unfortunately think that a lot of players would look at this and go, why would I not just play the remake? Even though there are actually a lot of reasons why they should play this first. Now, I can't not put Final Fantasy VII high. Like, it would be idiocy to say, hey, don't play the most legendary game in the entire franchise. But I don't think I would tell people to make it their first choice as a Final Fantasy game because of the fact that early 3D has aged so much less gracefully than sprite work has. But it's still an incredible game. Like, it's still amazing. Like, you would not be wrong to start with Final Fantasy VII. As a matter of fact, if you're looking at playing the Final Fantasy VII franchise, because it is kind of separate from Final Fantasy as a whole, I do think you should start with Final Fantasy VII, and I think there are tons of reasons why people should. It's a great choice as your first. There are a couple I think are better though, believe it or not. And this brings me to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is obviously much more modern, much more streamlined, much more catered to a modern audience than the original Final Fantasy VII is. So it's a great jumping point for players who have never played a Final Fantasy before and want the best iteration, from my perspective, of what modern Final Fantasy is. I am, however, going to pre-warn players who start with Final Fantasy VII Remake, because there are elements of the game, without going into spoiler territory or anything like that, that kind of expect you to have played the original Final Fantasy VII first. And this, by and large, is why I actually think there are better places to start than the Final Fantasy VII franchise, because there's more than one game in the franchise. If you want something long and sprawling and like filled with content, tons to do, other games to look at, including the original Final Fantasy VII, then I actually think Final Fantasy VII Remake is the best place for you to start, because you can get to the end of that game and then questions might be raised where you kind of go, oh, I want to explore this further. And the best place to do that is to go and play the original Final Fantasy VII. So it does tick the box that I want it to tick when it comes to these games, which is, if you play this game, will it make you want to play others in the franchise? And I think with Final Fantasy VII Remake, the answer is a resounding yes. It helps that Final Fantasy VII Remake, from a newcomer's perspective, is beautiful to look at. There's so much richness to the visuals, the music, the score in this game is absolutely stellar. There's tons to love here. I personally think that the combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake and its successors are some of the best that Final Fantasy's ever had as well, and I think that it appeals very well to a modern audience. You've got the action, you've got the turn-based, but it's not quite turn-based. It's unique, and I think that that works to its benefit, and it also still does feel like Final Fantasy. So if you played Final Fantasy VII Remake and then wanted to play one of the other games in the franchise, it didn't really matter which direction you'd go in, whether it be something like the original Pixel remasters or even something like 16, you can see the train of thought that led to Final Fantasy VII's combat system, and I think that that is a great place to jump from. And so even though I do think there are reasons to play the original Final Fantasy VII over Final Fantasy VII Remake as your first game in the franchise, being brutally honest, I just think Final Fantasy VII Remake is a much easier sell to a modern audience. Like, if you show someone new that's never played Final Fantasy before, Final Fantasy VII, and then Final Fantasy VII Remake, they're gonna gravitate to 7 Remake first. And I think if you're gonna get someone into the franchise, whether it be Final Fantasy VII's franchise or Final Fantasy as a whole, you can't really do much better than 7 Remake for that purpose. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, however, this is really easy to place on the tier list, and I shouldn't need to explain too much about it. This is a sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake, and you never want to start a story at the midpoint. So I'm not going to dwell too much on Rebirth here, but I implore you, as much as Rebirth is the most recent game in the Final Fantasy VII mythos, please don't start with this. You'll miss so much about what's going on if you don't play FF7 at least, or Final Fantasy VII Remake first. You need to start with one of those two if you're gonna go into the Final Fantasy VII franchise. Rebirth is an awful place to start because you just get plopped in the middle and you will have no idea what's going on. And I would argue that that's made even worse by Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, because Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion came out not too long ago between 7 Remake and 7 Rebirth, and I think this is arguably the worst place to start with Final Fantasy VII, even though it's a prequel. And I'm gonna ask you to allow me to explain why, because I can already see the comments from people who love Crisis Core, love Zack, etc., like screaming in the comments below. Let me explain it this way. If you are getting into Final Fantasy VII and you have only played Final Fantasy VII Remake, then Crisis Core, and then you're about to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, does the events of Crisis Core not horrendously spoil the beginning of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? If you think about where you start Rebirth at, I'm trying really hard to explain this without being spoilerific myself, it either confuses the player because of what they'd just done in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, or it just gives away the game completely. And I think that even though Crisis Core is a solid game in its own right, it is still a port of a PSP game. And it's a PSP game that was designed to be played like on the go. It was designed to be played in piecemeal sort of sessions. So you do a few missions, you'd come away, load up your PSP again later. Crisis Core is a game that is made for Final Fantasy VII's existing fans. I think it is one of the worst places you could start, certainly within Final Fantasy VII, if you're a newcomer. And so for that reason, Crisis Core's going in bottom tier. I'd actually rather you started with Final Fantasy II than Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Just because, at least with Final Fantasy II, you're not ruining the experience of other games in the franchise. Where I feel like if you play Rebirth or Crisis Core before Remake or 7, you're actively hurting your experience for the franchise as a whole. Which brings us to Final Fantasy VIII. Now, fun fact for you all, Final Fantasy VIII is actually my first Final Fantasy, and let's be real, it got me into the entire franchise. But I can see why this game probably caused people to say your first Final Fantasy is your favorite, which actually isn't the case for me, but a lot of people say that. And I think it's because this game is so divisive amongst the community that it's hard to put it at that mantle now where you could have done 20 years ago. Because, I mean, look at it. It's bombastic, it's dynamic, there's a lot going on. That intro, I remember looking up at a screen at Electronics Boutique, because yes, I am old enough for that, and thinking, I have to play this game. Do I think it still has that same impact? No, probably not, just because of how far games have come since Final Fantasy VIII first came out. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Final Fantasy VIII. A lot of people really don't like it though, so I think that the fact that it has such a polarizing kind of opinion on both sides would lean it towards being less recommendable for a newcomer. It's quite convoluted, where a lot of the previous games haven't been, so like the junction and draw system might be confusing to new players because you're kind of discouraged from using magic because you're supposed to use it to augment your stats, which means that you're locking yourself out of using it. So there are aspects to Final Fantasy VIII that are a little bit iffy, and the story kind of leans into that as well. It can feel a bit convoluted and confusing and a little bit Deus Ex Machina-y from certain places. There are scenes that I'm sure people who've already played Final Fantasy VIII will know I'm talking about here when I would say, I could see why people maybe wouldn't recommend this to a newcomer. So even though it was my first Final Fantasy, and I love Final Fantasy VIII, it's not my favorite, and I can see why there's a disconnect for a lot of players. I don't want to say that 8 is a questionable choice though for a first Final Fantasy, because the people who do love Final Fantasy VIII, and there are a lot of them, there's way more than people who are haters would lead you to believe, really genuinely love 8, and the cast of characters are so good. They're so good. I love so many of the characters in 8, and there's a lot of iconography that is pretty iconic, even if it's not up to the same levels as like the Buster Sword and that, because people know what the Gunblade looks like. The Revolver Gunblade is iconic, and Squall is an Edea. There's a lot of really cool imagery in Final Fantasy VIII, and the soundtrack is to die for. So I really don't want to put it in questionable choices, but like, yeah, I think I'm going to have to put it there because there is such a divide with 8 that there just isn't with a lot of the other games. But I do also think that no one Final Fantasy is gonna be everybody's favorite, and that's why I love the franchise as much as I do. So even if it's not your first choice, and I have put it in questionable choices as your first, please do explore Final Fantasy VIII when you get a chance, because you might love it. Oh, this was always going to be a challenging one for me. Final Fantasy IX is my favorite Final Fantasy, but I'm not talking about a tier list where I would recommend Final Fantasy to myself. I am talking about whether I would recommend Final Fantasy IX to a newcomer. And it's challenging, especially considering how much energy Square Enix has put into advertising Final Fantasy IX for its 25th anniversary without actually putting out a game to celebrate it. In terms of its story and its characters, definitely its characters, I struggle to find somebody that doesn't play Final Fantasy IX and love at least one of its characters. However, some of its characters are a lot less fleshed out than others. Not everyone gets the same amount of screen time in this game. Much can be said the same with Final Fantasy VIII as well, but there are other aspects to Final Fantasy IX that make it harder to recommend to a newcomer, certainly with the way that people play games nowadays. And that's simply down to the fact that Final Fantasy IX is the game that I feel is in most of need of an update, because the combat in this game is very sluggish and might frustrate newer players. I also see a lot of people that say that the art style is too childish for them. I think that's a BS reason to not play the game, but a lot of people do say that about Final Fantasy IX, so I adore everything about this game, but I can see why a first-timer might look at this and just dismiss it off the bat. And I don't want them to do that, but even if you get them to play it and look past the art style, the slowness of the combat might get them to not want to play it at all. And I think that's a real shame. I think that the fact that I wouldn't put it right at the top of my list for a first-timer is more of a commentary on people's attitudes towards games than it is about Final Fantasy IX. We're talking about the TikTok era, where people don't have the attention span to sit with something that they consider slower, and Final Fantasy IX is slower. Modern versions of Final Fantasy IX do have like speed up functions, that kind of thing. So do Final Fantasy 7 and 8. And in terms of visuals, I actually think that 9 is the nicest looking one of the PS1 era, like what one would consider the golden era of Final Fantasy. But like, I really want people to try it because it's actually very beginner friendly. Like, it's not, its difficulty curve is really seamless. There's a lot of like simplicity, but it's very and accessibility within Final Fantasy IX's progression systems and combat. It's easy to figure out what to do, but there's still enough meat in there for you to dive in and get stuck in with the different characters and what they do and how they play. There's a lot of love in Final Fantasy IX. And it was the first game that I was excited for after having played 8 and 7, like before it. And it's still my favorite to this day. I wouldn't want to recommend it to somebody, them sit there and go, nah, this is too slow for me, and then just not play it or any other Final Fantasy after because they thought it was just lacking quality of life, which is the unfortunate truth with 9. Had there been an announcement of a remake, which there was lots of rumors flying around for that kind of thing. It never happened. Maybe it still could. There's a lot of hype around Final Fantasy IX right now. And like with the 25th anniversary and all of the celebrations that Square Enix have put out about 9 when they didn't for 8, was like, it is something that put Final Fantasy IX in a lot of people's sort of crosshairs. So I don't think it's a bad choice. Like, I don't. And it is my favorite game in the franchise, so it pains me to not immediately put it in S tier. And I hope that people can understand why I'm not putting it up there, because I don't think that a new player would get it, like, straight away, just because of the way the PS1 era hasn't evolved in the same way that, like, modern games have. So I'm torn between putting it as a great choice or a solid choice. I actually originally was going to put it in questionable choice just because of how poorly it's aged compared to some of the other games in the franchise, but I don't think that's fair to it, and it really is, in my opinion, one of the best games in the entire franchise. So I do want people to play it. But I'm gonna stick with solid choice, and it will pain me to do it. I'm gonna spoil my ranking for Final Fantasy X right now. It's the one. It's the one, like, straight up. Final Fantasy X, whenever anyone asks me which Final Fantasy should I play first, my answer is always the same. It's Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is a lot of people's favorite Final Fantasy. It's actually not mine, but I don't think that any game in the entire franchise represents Final Fantasy better than Final Fantasy X does. The cast of characters is wonderful. The story is incredibly potent and poignant to this day. The love story, if like players who want like that visual novel-y aspect will get that. but it's not bogged down in cutscenes. There's still like a ton of meat in the gameplay. There's a lot of spectacle to be had in Final Fantasy X. There's a lot of depth in the combat. The sphere grid system is fantastic. I genuinely cannot fault this game to a newcomer. I also wholeheartedly believe that the conditional turn-based battle system in Final Fantasy X is the single best battle system that Final Fantasy has ever had. It's not, you don't ever feel rushed while playing Final Fantasy X. You always have time to plan your next moves. Strategy is really well crafted within Final Fantasy X. I could wax lyrical about how good this game is from an objective standpoint to anyone that will listen. I think the jump to PS2 visuals, like when the original came out for Final Fantasy X, and then the jump again to the HD remasters, also does Final Fantasy X a lot of favors in ways that the PS1 games don't quite have the same legs. You could show somebody Final Fantasy X and they will still go, oh, that's a nice looking game. Whereas if you show them something like the original Final Fantasy VII, then they're not going to look at it with the same eyes, because again, we're talking about a environment in which we live where games, if they don't look like Ghost of Tsushima, people go, oh, it looks like it belongs on the PS2. Well, you can show them a PS2 game and show them how amazing they could still be to this day. I'm sorry, Final Fantasy X is the one. Like, I've put more than one Final Fantasy in the start with these tier, because I genuinely think that different tastes cater to different people. Some people may prefer the pixel art style of Final Fantasy VI. Some people may want to dive into something with a wider array of lore and world building, and therefore the 7 Remake, or 7 Remake is a great place to start if you want to get started in that. The modern battle system might appeal to a newcomer with FF7, but in terms of like what makes a Final Fantasy, a lot of people find it really contentious. Certainly with the more recent games, they'll say stuff like, this isn't Final Fantasy. I can assure you, and I'm sure that you'll all agree with me on this, nothing on this list says I am Final Fantasy more than Final Fantasy X. And that's why I think it's the single best game for a newcomer to start with. Also, I realise this now, I didn't put Final Fantasy X-2 in this tier list, but for some reason when I uploaded, I'd forgotten the icon. But for the same reason as FF7 Rebirth, don't play FF10-2 before FF10. It's different. It's not as impactful as Final Fantasy II is. It's a sequel. You will spoil stuff from Final Fantasy X if you play FF10-2 first. Just don't start with that. Final Fantasy XI is peculiar. It's the first MMORPG that came from Final Fantasy, and obviously Final Fantasy XIV is much more recent, and the differences between Final Fantasy XI and XIV are apparent. And I feel bad about the fact that I can't put this high on the list, because it's a game I wish I had gotten into when it first came out, because I can imagine that when players first picked this game up and had the means to play with others, it was mind-blowing. However, we are talking about an MMO that predates World of Warcraft and still has a lot of those qualities that old MMOs have, like having to wait for an hour for a boat to turn up to pick you up to go to a particular quest. You'd have to decipher what you're supposed to do at any given time by yourself, or be led by someone else to do it. And there's still a thriving community for Final Fantasy XI. I've seen this firsthand. I played Final Fantasy XI for the first time this year, played it for quite an extensive period of time, and then decided that it just wasn't for me. It was too slow, it was too old, for want of a better term. It was too aged, and so for a newcomer, if I've turned around and I've said that something like Final Fantasy VII and IX is too old for a new player to play with, I can't not say the same for FF11, who kind of does it even more. However, again, like some of the other games on the list, players are looking for the lore and the world building more than they are with the gameplay mechanics or the core story of the game. People love to live in a world that they can be whatever they want to be. They want that immersion. It's not what I'm looking for from a game, which is why I probably checked out of FF11 a little bit quicker than a lot of people did. So I'm going to put it in questionable choices, especially considering that Final Fantasy XIV is doing stuff with Final Fantasy 11. Actually, do you know what? No, I don't feel right doing that because you need to have played 14 before you've played 11 in that case if you want those references. I think 11 does need to be in the Don't Start Here category. In fact, it definitely goes in the Don't Start Here category because if you've ever tried to log on to Final Fantasy 11, you have to get through the first real boss of Final Fantasy 11, which is the ability to log into it. That system is extremely archaic. The play online, really difficult. Like, it's definitely a hallmark of its time, and it hasn't aged particularly well. I think I have to put 11 in Don't Start Here just because of how old it is and how, more importantly, how old it feels. Final Fantasy XII is such an interesting game from a newcomer's perspective because if you play Final Fantasy XII first, none of the other Final Fantasy games are really like it. Like, it's very unique in the way that it plays. And I think that it has some of the best world building out of any Final Fantasy. I think Ivalice is an incredible setting. It's used multiple times across the franchise, even though the stories are quite separate from one another. And I love the story of Final Fantasy XII. It's very political, it's very mature. There's a lot to love about it. And I think that the Zodiac Age version of it that's available widely now is excellently done. Like, there's a lot of changes made to it from the original that a lot of newcomers would probably really like. However, I still wouldn't place this highly on a first-timers list for Final Fantasy. The story is told in a very different way to a lot of Final Fantasy games, so a lot of people don't particularly like Vaan, which is the protagonist of the game. And that's because he's not really considered the main character. Like, you are supposed to be viewing the events of what goes on through his eyes, and a lot of people don't like that. The combat is also a lot more MMO-like. I would say if you enjoyed the Xenoblade games, you'd probably really enjoy Final Fantasy XII as your first Final Fantasy, but don't go into this expecting an experience from other Final Fantasies that's similar to this. And the complex systems, certainly with the Gambit system, that a lot of people feel is too autonomous for them, I worry that somebody who came to Final Fantasy XII first might think it's just a bit too hands-off compared to a lot of the other games. So from that perspective, I would call 12 a questionable choice. I don't think it would be the end of the world if you started with 12, same like 8. 12 is quite divisive. Some people love 12 and really love the difference in its storytelling. I've always said that the protagonist of Final Fantasy XII story is the setting, and a lot of people don't like that. They want a more character-driven experience, so I don't think that they would get that from Final Fantasy XII. There's some lovable characters in there, your Balthiers, your Frans, etc. There's some Gabranth. There's a lot to love about 12, and players who play 12 tend to gravitate towards like it being one of their favorites or it being one of their least favorites. And I think that division is what makes me feel it's a questionable choice for someone who had never played a Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XIII is actually very similar in that it's quite divisive amongst its fans, but there is a very, very easy reason to suggest that you shouldn't start with this game first. For what it's worth, I actually really like Final Fantasy XIII. However, the only way you can access Final Fantasy XIII on modern devices is its PC port or the Xbox 360 version. The Xbox 360 version is fine, like you can get access to that on modern Xboxes, but there's no way to play it on PlayStation, and the PC port of this game is really not very well done. And there are criticisms towards Final Fantasy XIII that are valid. It is very linear. It's extremely linear, and a lot of people use that as leverage against it. I actually don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, certainly to a newcomer, because they don't want to be overwhelmed by like this big open world stuff, or at least I wouldn't want to be, but in a modern era, lots of people expect that kind of thing. So to explain to them, hey, this game's really linear, it's giving the TV series gets really good by episode 10, and a lot of people will immediately be warded away from that. There's a lot of really likable characters in this game, but there's also a lot of that aren't. Like, you know, characters like Lightning are really well developed. Characters like Snow and Hope are a lot less liked by the Final Fantasy community. So those things are all well and good. They're all taste level sort of adjacent, but the fact that you can't play this on every modern console, and even the ones you can, it's not the best version that you could get. We just need to see a remaster of 13. Similarly to that, like 13 does have other games that come off of it, so you actually have a trilogy of games with 13, which is 13, 13-2, and Lightning Returns, and I feel like Again, they're not available in such a way that it's all consolidated. You'd have to buy them all separately. Like, they're not expensive, but you'd still have to buy them all separately. If they release a remastered version of 13 and its 2 sequels, I'd actually suggest putting it in a solid choice because it is quite an easy game to get into. It's not super confusing. It's got a lot of really nice visuals. The music's really lovely. The paradigm shift system makes it more dynamic and makes you feel like you're doing more. But the linearity of it and the fact that the lore can be a little bit all over the place if you want lore diving, I just can't help but say that 13 is just not the best place to start based on its unavailability on modern machines. Final Fantasy XIV is hugely popular for a reason, and I think that at least in this day and age, it's actually the most popular Final Fantasy out of all of them. And if you want lore, world building, story, the social aspect that you wouldn't get from any other Final Fantasy, you really can't go wrong with FF14. 14's lore is very extensive. It's really in-depth. There's a lot of Final Fantasy XIV, and I've spoken to many a player who are frightened, honestly, of starting a game like 14 because it's so large. And I would love to make more videos to try and help people get into 14, because the first suggestion I would have is that you want to try and replace that sense of overwhelm with a sense of wonderment. You don't even have to change the wording of, oh, this game is like really big, and all you have to do is change the tone to go, oh, this game is really big. If you wanted to, you could play Final Fantasy XIV as the only Final Fantasy you play. And many people do, and I also understand that the idea that there is such a large time commitment to the game, there's such a stigma against a game that has a subscription cost to it because it's live service. There's going to be people that grind against that, and I absolutely respect and understand that. So my suggestion to you is, if you try the free trial, I know the meme of the have you like seen the critically acclaimed Final Fantasy XIV, that's a meme for people who already play 14 and not for newcomers, because I actually think that meme puts people off playing FF14 rather than helps them get into it. My suggestion is still to try the trial. By the time you get to the end of that trial, because it's also huge, you get the first 3 expansions for nothing, and you still like the game, then you're gonna continue to like it, and the subscription, it's worth every penny for you. Honestly, I think that 14 being such a self-sufficient system, and you literally can play Final Fantasy XIV and not play any other Final Fantasy, and you'd probably be fine, and there's a lot of people out there that do. I came to it from the angle of being a Final Fantasy fan. Other people come to it because they're MMO fans. So there's such a wide berth of people that will enjoy Final Fantasy XIV. I think it has to go S tier. I think it's a great place to start, because it can be the place you start and the place you finish, which can't be said for a lot of games, honestly. So I have a bit of a hot take when it comes to Final Fantasy XV, because much like some of the other entries, Final Fantasy XV is extremely divisive amongst long-time Final Fantasy fans, and I can absolutely accept why. It is quite shallow compared to a lot of the other Final Fantasy games in terms of its combat. There's not a lot of diversity amongst its cast. There's DLC that, you know, if you really wanted to dive into it, then you'd kind of want that. However, I think that a lot of those things that people criticize Final Fantasy XV for come from the perspective of somebody who's played a lot of Final Fantasies. I actually think that it's a pretty good place to start for somebody that's never played a Final Fantasy before. I certainly don't think it's the best place to start for Final Fantasy, but it does have the early semblance of the modern version of what Final Fantasy has become. It's real-time combat. That has been continued since then. There's a lot to like about the cast, even though there's not a lot of diversity in there. They're very likable as a as a quartet. They've got a really strong relationship between them. There's really likable stuff in this, and it was extremely popular when the game came out. So that you'll probably find that there's a lot of people that you can talk to about Final Fantasy XV that maybe you couldn't do with the earlier games. So I quite like Final Fantasy XV as a first Final Fantasy, as I think a lot of people's first Final Fantasy, certainly people who are younger than I am, their first Final Fantasy may well have been 15, and 15 was very much loved by its own fan base. So whenever I went to events for Final Fantasy, like even up until a few years ago, cosplayers, you'd see tons of people dressed up as Noctis, Lunafreya, Ardyn, all sorts of characters in Final Fantasy 15 because they're relatable to a lot of players, and I think that does speak volumes for it. I don't think it's the best because there is a shallowness to its combat, there is a lack of player agency, but the open world nature of Final Fantasy 15, even if it's not the best example of open worldness out there, and I'm not the biggest fan of open world, a lot of people do gravitate towards that kind of thing. So I don't think it's a bad choice for a first try. So I'm actually going to put it as a solid choice, even though there are marks against it. I just think that those marks against it would largely come from people who had played a lot of Final Fantasy and not somebody who'd never played it. So then it brings me to our most recent Final Fantasy, which is 16. And I do believe that there are plenty of people that have looked at Final Fantasy 16 as their first Final Fantasy and wondered what it was all about. However, if you're looking at playing the rest of the franchise and Final Fantasy 16 is your first, one does not necessarily inspire the other. There are a ton of arguments when it comes to Final Fantasy 16. When I say that one of the Final Fantasies is divisive, it's one thing. 16 was on another level. There are a ton of people that will say that Final Fantasy 16 is not a Final Fantasy game. And I don't agree with that statement, because I think that Final Fantasy is whatever the developers and the makers of the game want it to be. That's the point. They've been experimenting with their formula since Final Fantasy 2, and it's not for everybody. And that's okay. But because Final Fantasy 16 is a different type of game to anything that came before it, it's slightly harder to recommend it to a newcomer than some of the other games before it if you want them to get into the other games in the franchise. And that's because Final Fantasy 16 doesn't play anything even close to a traditional JRPG. Final Fantasy 16 is an action game. Like, it's a Devil May Cry type game. There are RPG elements to it, though they're actually a lot fewer and further between than you might think. And yet the game is also very, very heavy on its cutscenes. So if you enjoy sort of sitting down to watch a game rather than sort of like experience the game through its own gameplay, then Final Fantasy 16 is great for you. And if you want that kind of juxtaposition between heavy action and heavy length of cutscene, then it's great for you. But, and I speak for myself here, I found it quite jarring to sit through 40 minutes of cutscene to then have 10 minutes of heavy action and then go back to 40 minutes of cutscene again. So when it comes to ranking Final Fantasy 16, it's really tough because it's a very easy sell to a newcomer. It's gorgeous to look at. It's got a darker tone to a lot of the other Final Fantasies. There is a lot to love about it, but it does suffer from this dichotomy of what it's trying to be, because I feel like if you want one of those two things, you actually have better choices in either direction. If it's the lore and the world building and the story that you're after, I'd say Final Fantasy XIV is the one for you. If it's the action, then I'd say Final Fantasy 7 Remake is the one that's there for you. And if you want a more traditional Final Fantasy experience, then both 6 and 10 have got you covered for that. So I just feel like Final Fantasy 16 doesn't really have the same like hard sell that the others that I would say are the best to start with have. I don't think it's a bad choice. I don't think it's a great one. I would say that Final Fantasy 16 sits pretty firmly in the middle. So I do have a couple of spin-off games that I know are widely available, and I'll quickly rank some of those as well, just to close the video out. Ever Crisis, don't. Please don't start with a gacha game as your first Final Fantasy. Certainly not one that is pure fan service for Final Fantasy 7. I'll be honest, I don't think it's a very good game. I'm sorry to anybody that really loves it. I think it's really repetitive. I think it's very shallow. I have nothing particularly nice to say about Ever Crisis, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it as a first Final Fantasy. I actually would say the same about World of Final Fantasy. There are things to like about it. It's got a cutesy tone to it. People who like Pokemon, you might be able to like convert into Final Fantasy through World of, like WoF, but it is a fan service game, realistically. Like, it's a fan service game in that, like, it draws a lot of references from other games. It does have, like, all of the monsters are kind of, like, you know, essential from other games in the franchise. I don't feel like you can really play World of Final Fantasy without having played the others first. Stranger of Paradise is an odd one, because you would think with a name like Final Fantasy Origin, it would be a great place to start for players because they see the word Origin and think, oh, maybe this is a great jumping point for Final Fantasy. But because it plays nothing like any other Final Fantasy game because it's more a clone of Neo and is made by the same developers, then it's just not the right place to go. But it's a good game in and of its own right, and you could argue that if you play Stranger in Paradise and you like what you see of it, you might want to play Final Fantasy 1, which might then lead you into the others. So I don't think it's actually a terrible choice to start with. I probably wouldn't. Like, there's not many situations where I'd recommend it, but I could see someone who likes Souls-likes and things like that coming off of a game like Neo or Wolong and wanting to try something that's within that same vein that could then lead them into like questioning Final Fantasy and then wanting to explore more of what they saw of it. Though I must say Jack Garland isn't the greatest selling point for the rest of the franchise because there's nothing quite like him in the rest of the games. And then I'm going to be real with you, I really don't think that Type 0 is a great place to start either. Even though it is available on modern consoles, if you bought Type 0, a port of a PSP game, as your first Final Fantasy that is more action heavy, again, but it's not action heavy in the same way as the other games, I think you'd just confuse yourself as to what Final Fantasy really was. It didn't help that FF Type 0 is kind of in that weird interim period between Final Fantasy 13 and 15, where it's kind of a spin-off of 13, and 15 is also kind of a spin-off of 13, but 15 became its own thing, and Type 0 was kind of forced to become its own thing, so there's like tenuous links between 13, 15, and Type 0, but unless you already know the games really well, you're not going to understand what any of them are. So I think it's easier to just not to start with Type 0. And then finally, we have Final Fantasy Tactics, and I wanted to put this in the video because I actually do think it's a really strong place to start, even though it is more off the beaten path than a lot of the other Final Fantasy games are, especially considering that we're about to get a remastered version of it with the Evil East Chronicles. It's strange to explain this, but even though Final Fantasy Tactics is a tactical RPG and not a traditional JRPG, and that's something I've criticized a lot of the other Final Fantasies for, Final Fantasy Tactics still feels like other games in the franchise, whether it be the golden age of Final Fantasy, of which Final Fantasy Tactics was originally a part of. You still get that pixel sprite artwork that really translates well to a modern audience, certainly with updated visuals and a remaster. I genuinely believe that the story in Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the strongest that it's ever had. There's so much depth to Final Fantasy Tactics as well, and the ability to craft your own party, cross the job system over, which obviously it shares with earlier games in the franchise like 3 and 5. I actually think that despite it being a spin-off, Final Fantasy Tactics actually isn't a bad place to start at all. To be honest with you, Final Fantasy Tactics being re-released made me kind of think about this subject matter as a tier list and how I would recommend it, because I would recommend Final Fantasy Tactics to a newcomer, even though it is different, because it still carries all the hallmarks of all the things that people love about the original Final Fantasies. It's turn-based, it's strategic, it's trying to like really tell a story, but it's not bogged down in cutscenes. There's lore if you go looking for it. If you played FF Tactics and you really liked the world building, you could then go and play Final Fantasy 12, or vice versa. Either way is fine. But I feel like Final Fantasy Tactics still represents Final Fantasy in a way better than Final Fantasy 12 does. It's really hard to explain, but I want people to experience this game because the story is dark. It's, you know, human, there's relatability to it. It's very politically intrigued and it's very charged with human like emotion. I think Final Fantasy Tactics is a great choice. Like, I really do. I wouldn't put it up with 10. I would like 10 needs to be right at the front. Like, these aren't in any order, but 10, if there was a tier above start with these, I'd put 10 in it. But Tactics is actually really good. So now that you've seen my tier list, I asked my Patreon members to give a comment on which Final Fantasy they would recommend to a newcomer first. So let's take a look at some of theirs. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all of my Patreon members that submitted their choices for what Final Fantasy they'd recommend to a newcomer. But let's have a look at what we've got here. So Lady Janessa says 15 if you want to experience Final Fantasy going forward, so it's more modern iteration. 1 for the most vanilla experience, 7 for middle of the road, and not a serious answer, but 3 if you end up liking it, there's nowhere to go but up. I like the humor there. I don't know if I agree with 1 being the most vanilla experience. I'd actually say 4 would probably be the best choice for that, or 6, because because you have like a lot of extra layers to it that aren't detracting from that core experience, but I can understand the notion that 1 would be the one to go with if you want to start from the very beginning. Shiny Flux says 4 pixel remaster if you want retro, 10 otherwise, or 7 for the best one. To be honest with you, I think a lot of people would say 7, just start with 7. I think it's a great choice, but it wouldn't be my first choice for a newcomer. Pale Raider says, I think the best Final Fantasy to start with is 9. The story's well paced and easy to understand. In addition, all characters here to a preset job, which is a good intro to the job systems present in other games. Not sure I agree with that, but fair enough. Every party member also gets their own time in the limelight. Not sure I agree with that either, but I won't go into story spoilers for that, but there are certain characters that definitely don't get as much limelight as they should. The minigames are a mixed bag for every type of gamer. A Chocobo Hot and Cold is a good side activity where no matter what, if you would just want to dig up 1 treasure map or 100, either way you'll be rewarded with decent gear. I will be honest, I feel that your favoritism for FF9 is coming into play a lot here because there's a lot of statements there that I don't personally agree with, but it's all subjective, and where I don't think that FF9 is the best place to start, despite the fact that it's my favorite Final Fantasy, I can understand why you'd recommend it that way. So yeah, go off. Golden Garrus says, I'd say 10 myself. The leveling system is deep yet easy to understand, allows for customization, and every character is useful except poor Kamari. The story's really good, and the battle system is easy to grasp. I mean, Luca Yasha as well, I'll just quickly read the next one. I think 10 is the best introduction point for someone looking for a solid entry point into the franchise. In terms of story, combat, exploration, and challenge, I think it's very new player friendly while still being engaging. However, if you were looking for a more retro style experience, I'd recommend 4 or 9. Then for a more action style combat experience, 7 Remake or 16. I find it interesting that people have, like, this is why I display other people's comments, and if you want to be a part of this, then please do consider clicking the link in the description box below to get your thoughts across. But I'm surprised at how many people are saying 9 and how many people are saying 4 over 6, because I would have thought that more people would have said 6. And then finally, we have a comment from Defesh, who is brand new to my Patreon, so thank you very much for joining in with that, and I wanted to sort of highlight your comment as well. Final Fantasy IV captures the heart of what FF is all about without overwhelming new players with complex systems. If you want a classic, emotional, and streamlined introduction to the series, this is the one. Another Final Fantasy IV lover. It uses the classic ATB system without layering on job systems, junctions, materia, or sphere grids that later games introduced, which means you can focus on learning how Final Fantasy combat works without being overwhelmed by game-specific mechanics. It's also well-paced with little to no grinding required. I think my only argument against Final Fantasy IV, really, is the fact that you don't keep hold of your party. Like, the party comes and goes quite frequently, and I also feel like the pivotal point in the midsection of Final Fantasy IV, where your level gets reset to 1, might be pretty jarring for a newcomer, but I can understand why so many of you guys feel strongly about Final Fantasy IV, so while it's not at the top of my list, it's at the top of a lot of other people, so maybe that is the one for you. So thank you once again to all of my Patreon members that decided to put their comments forward for this video. It's really lovely to get other opinions on these things, and I want to really make apparent that my opinion is not necessarily correct. I speak from a place of experience, but that's not to say that my opinion is absolutely 100% correct. So thank you all very much for that, and if you would like to participate in videos like this and get your point across when it comes to tier lists, then please do consider clicking on the link in the description box below for my Patreon, where I'm redesigning all of the title cards that I hand make for every one of my patrons, so that you can have something in the credits of a video and also have something to take away for yourself as well. So thank you very much for that. So there you have it. Every mainline Final Fantasy weighed up for anyone looking to dive in for the very first time. Of course, there is no single right answer, and what makes the Final Fantasy series so special is how different every game is, meaning that there's probably a perfect entry point out there for you, and it may be one of the ones that's lower on this list. But I do think that some games are more suited to a newcomer than others. Hopefully, this tier list has helped you find the one that clicks for you. So if you're already a fan, I'd love to hear which Final Fantasy you'd recommend to a first timer. And if you were a newcomer yourself, please do let me know in the comments which one you're thinking of starting with. Either way, thank you ever so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and leave a comment as well to tell me what you'd like to see in tier lists like this in the future. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Take care.